during our summer series, Historical Cultural Literacy series. I am Mama McKinney, and I am the chairperson of the Socioeconomic and Analysis Education Committee. We are normally about 4 strong, but we are at various places this morning, but we're going to hold it down. So I think some of you know that the UNIA is having its program today honoring Runoko Rashidi. One of our members is there, another member is traveling, but Baba Kelechi and I are here. And as we are moving around and doing other things, but we will be here with you today. You're here because we have a really special program, but before we jump into that, I want to remind you, especially if there are those of you who are not members of Appeal, that Appeal is a nonprofit organization facilitating economic empowerment and educational enrichment through workshops, a think tank, a resource bank, and the development of a full-service financial institution focused on serving communities of people of African descent, locally, nationally, and internationally. That is our mission. And Appeal is actually an acronym. And it's an acronym for the Association of People for Pan-Africanist Economic Advancement Through Leverage. More information, of course, can be found on our website, Appeal Inc., or that place where you registered to be here today. And so another part of our being is to organize and strategically utilize the vast resources of people of African descent, wherever we're found, to facilitate economic empowerment. We realize, and one of the reasons for this committee and our financial literacy committee, is we realize that historically, and actually in more recent history, we have been taught to distrust and mistrust each other. And so we are here to say, wait a minute, let's do what our ancestors, what our people did. We trusted in each other because that's all we had. We had only each other. So we are always asking that you come and join us, become a member of Appeal so that we have a financial institution that serves our specific needs wherever we are. So again, thank you for being here. It's always special to have our guests today, and I know that that is why you are here. And I think we can always count on having Dr. Horne join us, and almost every time he joins us, is to share something new that he has worked on, but it's always connected to everything else that he has done. And so, as we know, Dr. Horne is a historian, an attorney, journalist, and political activist. He has published literally dozens of books, including Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000, and this summer's, excuse me, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationals and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Today, and as Dr. Horne mentioned when Baba Kelechi spoke with him, he is going to present on the capital of slavery, the history of slavery in Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865. And as he stated, this is really important to help us understand why or how it is that we are here today, because some of us still haven't paid attention and wondering, well, wait a minute, this just seemed to come out of nowhere. And I'm sure Dr. Horne is going to make certain that we are clear. And so what I would like to ask you all to do, we're going to ask you to remain muted. If you have a question or a comment, please drop it in the chat, but give Dr. Horne a chance to get moving and get started. And then what we will do, either Dr. Kelechi or I will come back and review questions, read them aloud, read comments aloud. So our discussion will actually be more in the chat so that we can give Dr. Horne an opportunity to respond. And at the end of his presentation, we'll be certain to update you on what to expect in our next session, which is next week, next Saturday. In addition to that, we'll talk a little bit about Black Saturday Co-op, and we'll talk a little bit about Founders Day. I'm saying that now, so you won't leave because you're going to be looking forward to hearing about that stuff, right? But without much further ado, without any other talking from me, welcome, Dr. Horne. Good morning. Good morning.
Muted.
You should be able to unmute. You are.
Okay,
We can
fine.
hear
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, yes.
I appreciate the invitation. I'll be speaking roughly for 45 minutes so that you can time what your responsibilities are for this morning. The first part will be a kind of contextual discussion that helped to produce this book. That is to say, the new trends in the writing of history, particularly by Black intellectuals and Black scholars that are rewriting the script with regard to the founding of the United States, with regard to Black history, and also helps to illuminate how and why it is that the Tangerine Tyrant is now trying to impose his own version of the history of the country, not to mention the history of Black people through pressure on the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C., because he finds these current renditions of history displeasing. Then after that contextualizing, I will then move to the body of my remarks this morning, which is, of course, a discussion of this book, The Capital of Slavery. And then finally, I'll cut to the chase and leap forward to the current moment, where, as you know, Mr. Trump has deployed National Guardsmen in the nation's capital, otherwise known as, quote, Chocolate City, unquote. Those two poles should not be disconnected or seen as coincidental. And whether or not Washington, D.C. is now being shaped as a kind of laboratory, a kind of testing ground for a new version, or perhaps I should say a renewed version of a peculiar kind of U.S. fascism with the residents of the district, not to mention those in surrounding areas, particularly in Maryland, being treated like a kind of guinea pig. So with that, let me proceed to part one, the contextualizing. You should know that as we speak, there have been a number of important contributions with regard to the history of Black people, the history of this country. Although often criticized, I would single out in terms of mass impact the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones of Howard University, who in 2019, under the aegis of the New York Times, sought to suggest that the revolt against British rule in 1776 that led to the creation of the United States of America was perpetrated in no small measure because of the desire by slave owners, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, the list is long, to escape creeping abolitionism in the metropole, in London, for example. Needless to say, this unleashed a furor, really vituperation, particularly by the high priesthood of historians, not to mention the right wing, who denounced Nicole Hannah-Jones. Recall that she lost a potential position at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill because of the 1619 Project. But despite this vituperation, it's fair to say that this has been an impactful work, with it being adopted and adapted in various school districts, leading Mr. Trump, at least in Trump 1.0, to enthrone the so-called 1776 Project, which seeks to combat the 1619 Project, because, of course, Professor Hannah-Jones suggested that the founding of this country needs to be revisited. In fact, historians have suggested that you cannot credibly discuss the United States as a so-called democracy until perhaps 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, we're marking the 60th anniversary of that potent, or I should say once potent legislation today as we speak, because of course now the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is being slated for gutting, spearheaded by the Chief Justice of the United States of America, speaking of one John Roberts. But it's not just Nicole Hannah-Jones. Perhaps the most garlanded Black historian of the late 20th and 21st century, I'm speaking of the late Tyler Stovall, once of University of California at Berkeley, wrote a book a couple of years ago before his unfortunate and tragic passing entitled White Freedom. The title says it all. And of course, you can infer reasonably that, like some other scholars, he has suggested that 1776 may have been a great leap forward for European settlers. It was not necessarily a great leap forward for the indigenous population who were subjected to an aggressive genocide following 1776. And I should also say that in the run-up to 1776, in order to understand why the colonists, the settlers, decided to revolt, you should also understand a bit of Native American history, that is to say, the so-called Royal Proclamation line of 1762, 1763, wherein the colonizing powers, speaking of London, had basically exhausted its patience with regard to expending blood and treasure, of combating Native Americans as the settlers moved across the North American continent, and therefore had demarcated a line whereby they said the settlers should not cross. That is to say, if you want to understand 1776, you have to understand material factors. The labor, or I should say the free labor of the enslaved, which was being subjected to contestation, not least in London, but also the question of land per the Royal Proclamation line of 1762, 1763. I should also mention in this context that most settler revolts viewed historically and transnationally have a certain odor to them. I'm thinking of the settlers' revolt in what is now Zimbabwe, once known as Rhodesia, November 1965, wherein the settlers, many of whom were related by blood to their kith and kin, including the spouse of Henry Kissinger, including President Lyndon Baines Johnson himself, not to mention the fact that the leader of the settlers' revolt, Ian Smith, had relatives in Southern California. But Ian Smith and his comrades said that they were seeking to walk in the footsteps of 1776. And of course, they were apprehensive, to put it mildly, about African majority rule, which Britain was then pressing. After all, Britain was being pressed by independent Africa, not to mention many Black Americans, with regard to its supposed support for the settlers in what is now Zimbabwe. And then, of course, there's the settlers' revolt in Algeria in the run-up to independence in that North African country in 1962, which almost led to the assassination of then French President Charles de Gaulle. This is recounted in the infamous novel, The Day of the Jackal, the settlers' revolt in Kenya, East Africa, which did not forestall the independence of that East African state in 1963. But I think the inference you might want to draw with regard to the positive spin put on the settlers' revolt in North America, as opposed to these others I've just mentioned, is that when you emerge victorious, oftentimes analysts and historians line up to give two thumbs up. And if you're defeated, as in Rhodesia, Algeria, Kenya, the historians and analysts do not necessarily line up and give two thumbs up. As is said, I think it was attributed to the late President Kennedy, that victory has many parents and defeat is an orphan, so to speak. In any case, it's not just Nicole Hannah-Jones and Tyler Stovall who have blazed this new trail. I'm thinking of one of our celebrated filmmakers, Raoul Peck, once Minister of Culture in Haiti. Uh, you may be familiar with his docudrama Lumumba about the founding father of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But I'm referring to his documentary, which you can find online. It premiered on HBO some months ago. I'm speaking of Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism. And by the way, that term settler colonialism is increasingly being applied to what is happening or what has happened here in North America. I think historians of the future will find it at least curious that oftentimes settler colonialism is applied properly to historic Palestine, but somehow it's not applied to what has transpired here in North America. I'm also speaking of the paramount Black intellectual Ishmael Reed of the San Francisco Bay Area, still fortunately in the land of the living as he creeps towards the age of 90. I'm thinking of his spoof and send-up of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza, speaking of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, where he basically adapts and adopts many of the tenets that I've just articulated with regard to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States of America. And of course, there are other works that I could mention as well. The late Charles Mills, you may want to consult his book, The Racial Contract, he being of Jamaican extraction, for example. So I could also mention forays into this field by indigenous scholars, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in the first instance, she too being of the San Francisco Bay Area. Ned Blackhawk of Yale, who happens to be indigenous, his book, The Rediscovery of America, which is quite illuminating, particularly with regard to the import and impact of the proclamation line, aforementioned 1762, 1763. So there is tumult, there is upset with regard to how history is being conceived and written, which is not unusual. Oftentimes, history is rewritten. You may be familiar with the book by W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, published in the 1930s. Up into that particular text, you had a kind of Moonlight and Magnolias version of slavery and the period following slavery, 1865 roughly to 1877, speaking of Reconstruction. That Moonlight and Magnolias version is represented in the cinematic defamation, speaking of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which you can still find online if you can stomach watching it, which portrays rather venal and corrupt Negroes who were trammeling on the purported rights of the settler population. And it's fair to say that this historiography that I've just outlined is consistent with Du Bois's work, which brings me to my own work. Some years ago, I published a book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of America, which echoes the work of Nicole Hannah-Jones. Some might say precedes the work of Nicole Hannah-Jones and Tyler Stovall and Ishmael Reed et al. And also, since that time, I've tried to develop some of the theses put forward in that work that come to fruition, I would hope, in the book on the table as we speak, The Capital of Slavery. One of the theses that I put forward, in addition to elaborating on this idea of settler colonialism, this notion wherein Europeans cross the Atlantic Ocean, initially from London, at least as I tell the story, in the 1580s to what they call North Carolina. And it was a heterogeneous mixture sponsored by the 1% in London, although the settlers themselves were of diverse and heterogeneous backgrounds. And what I tried to suggest that I think has moment for today is that from the inception of settler colonialism in North America, there was this notion of class collaboration. That is to say, those uniting across class lines, as opposed to engaging in class struggle for mutual benefit, which would include uprooting the indigenous and dragging Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free for mutual profit and benefit. Indeed, in terms of contemporary echoes, I don't think you can understand November 2024, or not to mention August 16th, 2025, understanding class collaboration, Mr. Trump receiving 77 million votes, as he has since January 20th put pressure on law firms, on media companies, on universities, et cetera, with his popularity ratings not necessarily plummeting to the basement as you might have expected. On the other hand, I put forward the companion notion that the enslaved population, the population of African descent, because of the objective material conditions that they faced, including a savage and cruel exploitation, working for free, being the unpaid sector of the working class, were forced by circumstance to engage in class struggle, everything from malingering to various forms of resistance, up to and including seeking to overthrow the state, which brings me to the book on the table, The Capital of Slavery. It starts, as the subtitle suggests, with the unveiling of the White House circa 1800, but rather rapidly it speeds ahead to the War of 1812, when you might recall that the United States of America tried to capture Canada, and that's still in the headlines, given Mr. Trump's threat to make this neighbor to the north the 51st state. But alas, what happened in return was that in August 1814, the Redcoats, the British, invaded Washington, D.C., were joined by enslaved Africans, setting alight the White House, sending President James Madison and his girlless spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, within the rebel Africans getting on British boats and sailing to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. In fact, when I was speaking a few years ago in New York City, some of those who were in the audience were descendants of those Washington, D.C. rebels from August 1814. But the settlers did not sit on their hands as this potential catastrophe unfolded. After the War of 1812 concluded, the settlers, including many of the leading lights of Washington, D.C., including the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, decided that a bright idea would be to deport the free Negro population, because you need to remember that pre-U.S. Civil War, pre-1861, the city of Baltimore, in many ways, was the most important city in the United States of America, at least as far as Black people were concerned, since it had the most substantial free Negro population, for example. And the free Negro population was scapegoated after what happened to President Madison, although it was the enslaved who did the damage to the White House. And this scapegoating led to the idea that the free Negro population should be deported in mass to West Africa. And therein lies the creation of today's state of Liberia, coming into existence 2 centuries ago. And then, after the revolt in neighboring Virginia, in Southampton, August 1831, by Nat Turner and his comrades, the idea took flight that a goodly number of enslaved Africans should be freed and deported because the settlers, particularly those of the slave-owning category, recognized that they were sitting on a volcano by seeking to compel Africans to work for free, despite the fact that these Africans had allies not only in terms of British abolitionism, but allies particularly with regard to the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system. One cannot downplay the profundity and significance of the Haitian Revolution, which is one of the reasons why Haitians are still paying the price for their vanguard role even today in 2025. Because like any revolutionaries everywhere and anywhere, the Haitian revolutionaries sought to spread their gospel. They were implicated in the attempted revolt of the enslaved in South Carolina, 1821, 1822, by Denmark Vesey, who was obviously inspired by the Haitian Revolution, as subsequent research has suggested. If you look at some of the revolts in the Caribbean, they too were inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And in fact, I talk about this at length in my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, and which is about to be translated into French. If you have any friends and comrades in the Francophone world, it should be out in a few months. And not to mention, of course, the indigenous population. There has been quite a bit of scholarship of late on relationships between the indigenous and the Africans. To be sure, it's two-sided. On the one hand, you had indigenous groupings like the Cherokee of the southeast quadrant of North America, Georgia, for example, who tried to assimilate, including becoming Christians, including developing an alphabet for their language. Their newspapers can be found in the Huntington Library just outside of Pasadena, California, including becoming sedentary agriculturalists, and of course, including becoming enslavers of Africans. But what happens, as you may recall, is that in this white supremacist nation, that was insufficient. And so when President Andrew Jackson, the Tangerine Tyrant's favorite chief executive, comes into office in the late 1820s, he embarks on what is called the Trail of Tears. And the Cherokees oftentimes were forced at gunpoint to move out of their mansions in the southeast quadrant of North America. And European settlers just off the boat moved in to their mansions, having to do little more than sweep the floor in order to make these mansions comfortable. But that's just one aspect, because I'm sure you recall that there were scores, there were dozens, there were hundreds of Native American groupings. And it would be a mistake to suggest that the Cherokees were emblematic and indicative of the indigenous response to enslaved Africans, because that would not explain the Seminoles of the state of Florida, who in some ways, as many of the settler leaders suggested, as they were involved in a round robin of wars with the Seminoles in 1819, 1820, the 1830s, the 1850s, some of the most brutal and bitter wars that the U.S. military was involved in before the Civil War, for example, that they had welcomed enslaved Africans into their ranks to a certain degree. You had enslaved Africans in leadership roles. In my book on Texas, the Counter-Revolution of 1836, I talk about something similar with regard to the people we refer to as the Kiowa, Kiowa. So with that balance of forces, it's understandable why the settlers thought that the better part of wisdom would be to deport the free African population, particularly from Baltimore to West Africa, and then post Nat Turner deporting a number of emancipated, formerly enslaved Africans to Liberia. But what's interesting about Liberia, as I tell the story, is that on the one hand, one would be justified in terms of looking askance at the conflict between some of the arriving U.S. Negroes in West Africa and their conflicts and contradictions with the pre-existing African population, particularly the Kru, K-R-U, leading to bloody conflicts. But on the other hand, as I point out in the book, if you look at the Declaration of Independence of Liberia in the 1840s, it's quite progressive. And in fact, as I point out in the book, independent Liberia then sought to ally with British abolitionists, ally with Haitian revolutionaries in order to put pressure on the United States of America. And that brings me to one of the unique aspects and one of the peculiarities of Washington, D.C., that I would hope many of our friends in the nation's capital would seek to take advantage of. That is to say, as is well known, it's the home of a number of diplomatic legations. That is to say that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of diplomatic legations in Washington, D.C. Historically, the settlers looked with a jaundiced eye at potential relationships between the Black population of the District of Columbia and many of these diplomatic legations. You may recall that recently I published a book, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And in that book, I posited that in order to understand the agonizing retreat of U.S. segregation, U.S. Jim Crow in the 1950s, one of the factors you have to take into account is the arrival of African students, particularly from Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. Recall the arrival of Barack Obama Sr. at the University of Hawaii in the late 1950s, just as statehood was being consummated in 1959. And it was difficult for the police and others who were interested in manhandling Black people in the district. It was difficult for them to distinguish Nigerians, Kenyans, and Ghanaians from Black Americans. Interestingly enough, as I talk about in the book, many of Black Americans got the bright idea that they should try to disguise themselves as Africans in order to escape roughhousing, for example. And then the State Department responded by suggesting that the African students should be given a button to put on their lapel to show that they were not necessarily Black Americans, and therefore they should be treated with dignity. But in any case, you can imagine how this dynamic leads to an agonizing retreat from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, because the United States was concerned about winning hearts and minds in Africa, not least Nigeria, a major oil-producing nation, for example. And you had a similar dynamic unfolding in Washington, D.C. in the 19th century, albeit, of course, most of Africa being colonized, and Haiti being denied diplomatic recognition from the United States of America until the Civil War erupts in the 1860s. And when Haitian diplomats start showing up in Washington, D.C. In the 1860s, some of the settlers began to literally and figuratively lose their minds. Some of them actually committed suicide because they thought the world had been turned upside down with the arrival of these Haitian diplomats. And that brings me to October 1859, when the world is turned upside down once again with the revolt by John Brown and his comrades in what is now West Virginia, what was then Virginia, speaking of Harper's Ferry. an attempt for an armed, among other things, of an armed overthrow of the system of slavery, or at least that was what was projected. The book actually begins with one of John Brown's Black comrades, speaking of Osborne Anderson, who loved to tell the tale. He escaped and then wrote about this particular venture. And he gets the drop on Lewis Washington, who is a lateral descendant of the father of the Republic, speaking of George Washington. And the story then motors ahead from there. And of course, as you know, John Brown was executed. As noted, Osborne Anderson and other comrades escaped. But that helped to trigger the U.S. Civil War. And I should also mention the role of Canada once again, because John Brown and his comrades, they basically plotted the attack on Harper's Ferry in Ontario, in what is now southern Canada. And indeed, we should not forget that Canada played a preeminent role in terms of providing a sanctuary for fleeing enslaved Africans. And if I may, let me make a footnote, a lengthy footnote at this point with regard to Canada, because I've spent most of the year in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. I had begun telling a story or researching a story about what happens in the spring of 1858 when the Black population of San Francisco moves en masse to British Columbia at the invitation of Sir James Douglas, a man of African descent with roots in Guyana, the only English-speaking country in South America, a former British colony. They move in the hundreds to British Columbia. But the story then expands, as I will begin to write, to talk about the differences between settler colonialism in Canada. Somehow this has escaped the attention of many of our friends on the left in particular. That is to say, that colonialism, Canadian style, was extractive. The Hudson Bay Company, chartered in 1670, going into bankruptcy in 2025, interestingly, bought by a Chinese billionaire, was involved in extractive colonialism, particularly the fur trade with the indigenous of the Pacific coast. As we all know, south of the border, it was settler colonialism with this unique construction of this new identity politics of whiteness, whereby those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Welsh, English versus Scots, British versus German, German versus Pole, Serb versus Croat, Russian versus Pole, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. All of a sudden, when they crossed the Atlantic, in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they adopt a new identity, which is whiteness, for example, which is fundamentally a war-fighting identity, and begin to unite across class lines, as noted a few moments ago, and begin to uproot the indigenous and enslave the Africans. In any case, back to the major thread, after John Brown's raid and the execution of John Brown, there follows the U.S. Civil War. And I think part of my contribution to the literature in the book at hand is talking not only about emancipation in the District of Columbia, which precedes the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863. And that ties into the unique status of Washington as the capital city, which I'll talk about in the third segment, which deals with contemporary echoes. And what's interesting about emancipation in the district is the precedent that was set. The precedent being that the enslavers received reparations, which was not unusual. Recall that after the success of the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was forced at gunpoint to cough up billions of dollars in contemporary terms to the former enslavers from France. After British emancipation, circa 1833, 1834, London compensated the enslaving class quite handsomely, I might say. And with emancipation in the district, you likewise had compensation to the enslavers. However, as you also probably know, there was no compensation to the enslavers. And as definitely not the enslaved, post 1865. And there hangs a tale because I dare say, as I've suggested numerous times, that in order to understand the ferocity of white supremacy in the United States of America, you have to understand the fact that the enslavers had their most valuable investment taken without compensation. As you probably know, on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, the investment in enslaved Africans was the most valuable investment in the United States of America. I had mentioned in one book that in terms of the unlimited African slave trade, it was one of the most lucrative investments known to humankind. You can invest $1 and get $1,700 back. And there are those who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, not to mention sell some African they did not know. And so I think that going forward, we need to tease out the inferences to be drawn, the implications of this uncompensated expropriation of an investment. In fact, when I tell this to my students, you know how students are nowadays, as I'm talking, presumably trying to impart wisdom, they're fiddling with their smartphones, looking at basketball scores, Rihanna videos, etc. And so I'll grab their phone and say, I've just expropriated your private property without compensation. I'm sure you're very angry. You want to take me outside and thrash me, I'm sure. And I think that if you understand that kind of vignette, you can understand the ferocity that follows the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, etc. And that brings me to part 3 of my remarks this morning, which is the contemporary echoes. As you probably know, the Tangerine Tyrant has sought to take over the police in the District of Columbia. He just received a setback in court. He was trying to appoint the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, as a kind of proconsul in the district. They have retreated from that position, but have not retreated altogether from this cockamamie idea that the District of Columbia police force should be somehow federalized. I should also mention that National Guards persons, or National Guardsmen, if you like, have been deployed to the district or in the process, which is very ominous. You may recall my book on the Watts Uprising, Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s. Of course, we're marking the 60th anniversary of that epical turning point in U.S. history. And the bloodshed in Washington, in Los Angeles, where the Watts Revolt takes place, is prompted in no small measure by the deployment of National Guards persons, oftentimes trained in fighting wars, oftentimes trained to shoot first and ask questions later. This is very ominous and dangerous with regard to what's unfolding in the District of Columbia as we speak. This is also rather unsettling, to use the term applied by Mayor Bowser of Washington, because Washington, as you know, constitutionally has oversight, if you like, by the U.S. Congress, which controls the budget strings. And so when National Guardsmen were deployed to Los Angeles some weeks ago, you had protests not only by the mayor, and you might want to contrast the protests from Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles and Mayor Bowser of Washington, who was more constrained because of the unique status of Washington being the capital city and therefore not having a governor, whereas California has Gavin Newsom with presidential aspirations all of its own, and therefore, in a sense, is hardwired to object to the deployment of these National Guards persons. This helps to make Washington, D.C. a kind of soft target, if you like. It helps to make Washington, D.C. a laboratory for perhaps a kind of neo-fascist experiment. Washington, D.C., unlike California, Karen Bass has this kind of backup as well, has two senators, Adam Schiff, now under investigation by the Trump administration. Certainly, they want to put him behind bars, not to mention Alex Padilla. You might recall the confrontation he had a few weeks ago where he was wrestled to the floor when he sought to ask some questions to Ice Barbie, Secretary Nome, head of Department of Homeland Security. Washington, D.C. has no senators. Washington, D.C. Has a congressional representative, speaking of the 80-plus-year-old Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who, according to press reports, is, shall we say, enfeebled, and in any case has circumscribed voting rights. Many have made the point that this notion that Mr. Trump put forward to justify a so-called emergency, mandating seizing control of the Department of Police in Washington and sending National Guards person was because of a so-called crime wave that apparently statistics do not bear out. And I should also mention that Washington, D.C. already is one of the most heavily surveilled cities on the planet. I make that point in the aforementioned book, Revolting Capital. Not only do you have 17 different intelligence agencies headquartered in this district, a city of only 700,000 people, but you have the FBI. And of course, FBI agents also have been deployed to the streets of Washington as we speak. And I think we should be clear that if you examine the ostensible trigger for this deployment, it gives an idea as to who may be in the crosshairs. Recall that it was just a few days ago that a young man, Euro-American, a former comrade of Elon Musk, the South African-born billionaire, erstwhile first buddy of the Tangerine Tyrant, this comrade of Elon Musk apparently was involved in a carjacking. It was said that those attempting to carjack him were Black youth, and he emerged apparently bloodied, at least according to certain press reports. And that was the ostensible trigger for Mr. Trump deciding that enough is enough. You should draw the reasonable inference that Black youth are in the crosshairs, which is nothing new. Black youth were in the crosshairs during the times of slavery. Black youth were disproportionately lynched following the demise of slavery post 1865. And so if we have any regard for our younger generation, we should be raising our voices with regard to this totally uncalled for deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. Likewise, the U.S. administration, like previous administrations, they're quite skeptical of the Black majority in Washington, D.C. And of course, it's diminishing in light of the other weapon that's been unveiled against them, speaking of gentrification. But in any case, recall that it was just a few days ago that Attorney General Pam Bondi, or Scam Blondie, as she's oftentimes referred to, decided to impanel a grand jury, not in the District of Columbia, but in South Florida, to investigate the claims concerning the so-called Russiagate scandal, because according to press reports, like many administrations, she is skeptical of the Black majority in terms of following a nostrum that a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. That's the way the law supposedly works, but she apparently did not feel that the Black majority in Washington would follow that script. So the grand jury is impaneled in the district. This is one of the contradictions of the post-1954 retreat from Jim Crow. That is to say, Washington, D.C. having a sizable Black population as a legacy of slavery, as a legacy of being bordered by the preeminent pre-1865 state of slavery, speaking of Virginia. And once Jim Crow begins to retreat, you wind up with this phenomenon of Black juries. I talk about this with regard to a number of scandals that inevitably envelop the White House and the response of these Black jurors with regard to these trials, going back, if you want to consult the record, to the legal troubles of the comrade of then President Johnson, speaking of Bobby Baker, when there was a lot of comment on how the Black jurors responded to his indictment. And that's not to mention the fact that the Black majority of Washington is viewed skeptically. There are those with memories like elephants who have not forgotten what happened in August 1814. They still see Black people as a kind of national security threat. And this leads me to my final point, which is that I began by talking about the trends in the historiography. And I think that what I should have mentioned then, and I'll mention now, is that the rise of this new work, not only by myself, but by Tyler Stovall, Raoul Peck, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Charles Mills, it really reflects a political trend. Because I think what happens post-1954, post-Brown versus Board of Education, and I've talked about this in a number of books, is that as a result of what I call the Compromise of 1954, that is to say, anti-Jim Crow concessions, which we understandably and justifiably celebrate. But oftentimes what's forgotten is the price of those concessions, which was tossing overboard some of our wisest leaders, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, multilingual internationalists. And given the balance of forces in the United States of America, where you have this settler majority, which still tends to lean towards the right in this majority, we've relied historically upon global trends in order to redress that imbalance. But now, there are hardly any organizations, any leaders who are thinking along those lines. I mentioned the role of Canada. I mean, here you have a possible perfect marriage between Canada, which is under the gun right now, seeking to avoid annexation, and Black Americans under the gun. But there does not seem, as far as I can tell, any sort of discussion along those lines, not to mention our southern neighbor, Mexico. Mr. Trump at the same press conference, or perhaps shortly thereafter, when he was talking about the alleged problems of Washington, he also referenced potential military invasion in Mexico because of fentanyl, and supposedly stemming what he would call the tidal wave of drugs from south of the border into the United States of America. During the bad old days of slavery, of course, we were in close contact with our friends in Mexico. In fact, the president of Mexico in the late 1820s, Vicente Guerrero, moves to abolish slavery, which of course triggers the revolt by the enslavers in the then Mexican province of Tejas, or Texas, leading to Texas independence, then Texas becoming a state, etc. So I'll stop on that particular note, although obviously I have much more to say, particularly about these neo-fascist trends, also replicated, I'm afraid to say, in the economy, with regard to pressure on big law firms, pressure on big media, pressure on universities, pressure on certain corporations, Intel, for example, of Silicon Valley, NVIDIA, 4 trillion plus corporation, which is going to be coughing up what amounts to an export fee to the US government, that is to say, to the Trump regime and his cronies. But in any case, those latter tales or stories also reflect this creeping fascism, which I hope we're all concerned about. Thank you very much for your attention, and I take it that we'll now hear from the moderators of our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Horne. That's really has been an incredible recitation presentation. I know we do have some questions, so we're going to go ahead and entertain them.
Are you still there? Can people hear me? Just give a thumbs up or something.
Ishmael Reed, which was the book that you mentioned? I love the book by Ishmael Reed that you had mentioned.
Well, it's a play, actually. And if you just put in your search engine, Ishmael Reed, Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the play will come up. And in fact, the play has been published in book form by a publisher in Canada. So if you put Canada into those search terms, it also should come up. And of course, Ishmael, as is his tendency, has also given a number of lectures, which you can find on YouTube. Yeah, The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. That's my friend Ron Presley, who just added that clarification. Okay, I'll read out the question. This is from Emmett Murphy. Dr. Horne, when you look at these political trends you have referenced and the lack of global trends to rebalance them, do you have thoughts on the speed of the impact of these political trends, and particularly on whether we can rebalance them by the midterm elections and then the presidential elections, or have we run out of time to avoid a full-on autocracy? It's a very good question. I can only engage in speculation, hopefully informed speculation. On the one hand, you have the battle of the gerrymanders, with Texas seeking to redistrict the congressional seats and drive out of power Congressman Al Green of the Congressional Black Caucus from Houston, who had a confrontation with Mr. Trump a few months ago as Mr. Trump was addressing Congress. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Dallas. And the idea is to scoop up 5 new seats because the opposition only needs 3 seats to claim the majority. If they claim the majority, I dare say that Mr. Trump feels that he'll be subjected to an impeachment process. California, per Governor Newsom, is putting on the ballot a measure that would allow California to redistrict, which would allow, it is said, the Golden State to remove 5 Republicans from the House. I noticed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, one of these Republicans, Kevin Kiley, had an op-ed piece where he pleads for a ceasefire, because I guess he wants to keep his job. There's been talk about Governor Pritzker of Illinois acting similarly. Governor Hochul of New York State has spoken in similar terms. There's been pressure on Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, who has presidential ambitions, to move similarly, although since there's only, as I understand it, 1 Republican in the Maryland congressional delegation, I guess you could redistrict and remove that 1 Republican, presumably. So that's what's happening on the legislative front. On the statewide front, it's too soon to tell how these midterm congressional elections of November 2026 will eventuate, it's too soon to tell, certainly, about how the presidential election of November 2028 will eventuate. However, I must say, to be honest, or actually realistic, some of the trends I've outlined are rather disturbing, particularly these trends towards neo-fascism. I think that with regard to our movement, there has not been sufficient internationalism to countervail these disturbing domestic trends. The analogy I oftentimes employ is that it's akin to a patient who comes to the doctor's office and after smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 30 years, expects the doctor to work miracles. And so I think that right now, given how we've responded over the last 70 years, and given how our opposition has responded, in some ways we're analogous to that imaginary patient. But I will not end on that note. I think, once again, that it's too soon to tell how these elections in the United States will turn out, because there's just so many X factors involved, not least X factors external to the United States of America. For example, after living in Canada for most of this year, it's clear that the conflict between the United States and Canada, which in some ways it's its most important trading partner along with Mexico and perhaps China, it's having monumental impact on tourism. It's having monumental impact on the spirits industry, the liquor industry. There's a mass boycott against U.S. bourbon and whiskey. How that will impact the state of Kentucky and otherwise a red state is unclear. And that's just one example amongst many about how factors external to the United States will impact the U.S. domestic situation. All I can say is stay tuned and stay aware. Kalechi, are you still there?
There's another question in the chat. If you like, I can read it, or you can read it.
Okay, can you speak to the Israel-Palestine and Russia-Ukraine wars and any intersection with the struggle of Black people in the United States? With regard to the former, I mentioned a few moments ago that I've spent a good deal of the year in Canada, and one of my projects is looking at comparative settler colonialism on both sides of the border. And I must say, being in Canada this year and reading about the terror inflicted by the settlers in the occupied territory, it struck a chord with me because at the same time, I was researching the terror that was inflicted by the settlers in what is now the U.S. Pacific Northwest, particularly today's state of Washington, where you had some of the bloodiest conflicts between the indigenous of that territory, the Walla Walla, the Cayuse, the Yakima, the Palouse, etc. And what was interesting, and this also takes place in Texas as well, if you look at my Texas book, is that oftentimes the settlers themselves felt that the U.S. military was insufficiently aggressive in routing the indigenous population. You have the same thing right now on the West Bank, whereas the settlers themselves have been in the vanguard of arson being inflicted on the Palestinians. The momentum to expel the Palestinians to South Sudan, which is the latest story, it comes from the settlers. One of the problems right now in historic Palestine is that many Israelis are fleeing, particularly to Cyprus. For those of you who have a mind towards investment, you may want to look at real estate in Cyprus because many of the Israelis are flooding into Cyprus in the Mediterranean and driving up real estate prices through the roof. For example, they're fleeing to Australia, they're fleeing to Brooklyn. But that's leaving this hard core of pro-Netanyahu supporters, which does not bode well for the Palestinians. On the other hand, we're looking with eager anticipation to the UN General Assembly being convoked in a few weeks in New York, United Nations in New York. We are all paying attention to the fact that qualified endorsement of Palestinian statehood, baby steps in a progressive direction have been taken by Canada, Britain, France, Australia, and perhaps New Zealand, amongst other states. This is not good news. But certainly, I think that we need to pay careful and close attention to what's unfolding in historic Palestine, because some of these Zionist billionaires who are behind the depredations in historic Palestine are also some of the biggest supporters of Mr. Trump. Miriam Adelson, for example. Interestingly enough, Miriam Adelson is not only a big supporter of Netanyahu and Mr. Trump, you probably know as well that she's a major stockholder in the Dallas Mavericks basketball team, buying out the interests of Mark Cuban. She also is heavily invested in Chinese casinos, particularly in Macau, the former Portuguese colony, now under the jurisdiction of the People's Republic. That perhaps raises a certain pressure point for our movement. So there are many reasons for us to draw parallels between settler colonialism in North America and settler colonialism in historic Palestine. With regard to Russia-Ukraine, I think my take on the Alaska summit, and you can find my take at more length on the website of WPFW-FM, the Pacifica radio station in New York, the program On the Ground, broadcast Friday morning. It's an hour show. My comments are in the last half hour, where as I analyze the situation, I see that the United States is overstretched right now. It's trying to remake the fateful deal they made with China some decades ago, which was an anti-Soviet deal unleashing massive direct investment in the People's Republic of China, now creating this juggernaut. Sharp clashes between the US Navy and Chinese Navy in the South China Sea just this week. The United States has finite resources, and in any case, is heavily dependent on the People's Bank of China to buy US Treasury bills to keep the US government afloat. Many analysts suspect that there will be a reigniting of the war between Israel and Iran, the so-called 12 Days War, basically in an unsatisfactory manner for the U.S.-Israeli side in June 2025, despite the claim of obliterating Iran nuclear facilities. That's likely an exaggeration. In any case, the regime was not overthrown. That will also strain the resources of Washington, and Washington will have to, in my estimation, bow to the Zionist billionaires who, as noted, are on both sides of the fence with regard to Israel and the United States, Israel and Trump. And then the little notice deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan, brokered in Washington, very advantageous for Washington. And given the fact that both countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, border both Russia and Iran, it opens up a pressure point for Washington to pursue against Russia and Iran without expending these billions in Kiev. And with regard to Kiev, a good deal of the momentum for U.S. continuation of support for the Kiev regime comes from the Europeans. And increasingly, the Trump wing of the ruling class sees the Europeans as competitors, not necessarily as allies. And in fact, in terms of the aforementioned Canada, they want to turn this erstwhile ally into a neo-colonial appendage. Look what happened to Switzerland, albeit not a member of the European Union, 9 million strong, being hit by eye-watering tariffs. In other words, there's this attempted wealth transfer from Europe to Washington, which then will compensate, at least in the minds of some, with the tax cuts for the billionaires, because it will be replaced by looting and plundering nations like Switzerland, not to mention South Africa, Lesotho, Brazil, India, etc. So once again, the bottom line is, I think the implication and the import of what I've just been saying is that it's misguided to think that Black people can dig ourselves out of the deep hole in which we find ourselves with a reliance wholly and solely on the domestic forces in the four corners of the United States of America. I think that that's poppycock. I think that I'd like some of what you've been smoking, if you actually believe that, because history bears out the reality that we've had to rely on the international community. But as noted, 70 odd years ago, we made the fateful and fatal decision to bail out of internationalism in favor of relying upon the liberal wing of the ruling class. But now we see the liberal wing of the ruling class, they can hardly defend themselves. They're all lawyering up. I mean, New York Times did an audio piece the other day talking about the Trump attempt to put Barack Obama in jail. I mean, that's the import of impaneling this grand jury in South Florida, for example. Not to mention putting John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, and Clapper, and Jim Comey, Adam Schiff, Letitia James. The plan is to put all of them in jail. And so to think that this is what we can rely upon, when actually they can hardly save themselves from jail. How are they going to save us? So anyway, that's enough from me.
Yes, Dr. Horne, we have a few more questions, but we did skip one I wanted to have you address real quick. I'll combine these two. One person asked, how can we get the word out? And somebody else asked, what if the Tangerine Man loses the next election? We will be left with a skeleton government. That was more of a comment than a question. I'm not sure if you want to address that before we address the next question.
No, I'll move on. And the question, do you see any significant pushback from Black members of Congress to the current administration's open attack on African-American history and beneficial programs? The answer is yes and no. Certainly, you've had pushback from the aforementioned Al Green of Houston, Jasmine Crockett, Texas, for example. I've been disappointed by Congressman Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who has echoed Israeli talking points. Now, of course, you could make the argument that being from New York State, New York City, where Zionism rides high in the saddle, that he has few alternatives, but that does not explain why he is not endorsed to this point his fellow resident of Queens, speaking of Z.K. Mamdani, Z. Kwame Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for mayor, who also has not been endorsed by Hakeem Jeffries, the speaker in waiting, if you believe the press. And so that's quite disappointing. And it's also not politically wise because Kwame Mamdani is ahead in the polls. He has weak opposition. The incumbent Eric Adams, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump organization, recall how he was managed so far to evade felony charges because of deals with the Justice Department. And then the other major opponent being the sex pest, the disgraced Andrew Cuomo, not to mention the fossilized relic from the past, speaking of Curtis Sliwa, the Republican nominee. And so apparently Kwame Mamdani will become the next mayor of Gotham. And I would think that it would be in the interest of Gregory Meek's constituents, not to mention Hakeem Jeffries' constituents, to try to build bridges to the eventual victor. But alas, that has not happened. Here's another one. I've heard you mention previously the importance of the upcoming CARICOM Africa Summit. Can you share your thoughts on this with us, or your involvement of American Africans in this summit? Yes, I have mentioned this many times. It'll be opening in a few weeks in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, a historic face-to-face summit between leaders of the 4 dozen plus. Sorry, hold on. Let me plug in my computer before I lose juice and embarrass myself. Hold on for a second. Okay. Historic summit between the CARICOM, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago, et cetera, and the 4 dozen plus independent African countries. Reparations is high on the agenda. They had a preliminary summit, mostly virtual, in Grenada just a few days ago. Will there be a delegation involvement of American Africans in this summit? Apparently so. I've been in touch with some folks from the San Francisco Bay Area who plan to show up. I think it would be wise for more who are capable, have the time and the resources to do so, because I think it's going to be a historic turning point with regard to our struggle, because we need all the help that we can get. And of course, to repeat, the antagonists that the Caribbean and the African Union are facing are the same antagonists that we're facing. That is to say, the Trump regime in Washington and their minions and acolytes. So it would be wise for us to participate.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. Now there's also coming up, this is not in the chat, this is coming from me. Coming up in September is the, I want to make sure I have the actual right information in front of me. Coming up in September is the Race First Convention. How impactful do you think a Race First Convention can be for African people in America, globally, given what is happening in this country?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on what approaches they take. It depends on if they're going to reach out to the Caribbean, reach out to Africa on a common platform, for example. Because, as I said, to think that we should only operate domestically is misguided thinking.
Yeah, that's suicidal.
It's
I agree.
History has not borne out that supposition.
Right. I totally agree.
Oh,
So there's
here's a
another
question.
question. Yes,
Okay.
speaking of South Africa, how secure is President Ramaphosa and the ANC considering their internal pressures as well as the external pressures emanating from Washington for taking Israel to the ICJ?
Well, I'm happy to say that I've spent a lot of time focused on the southern cone of Africa. I lived in Zimbabwe, wrote a book on Zimbabwe. I wrote a book on the Southern African liberation struggles, white supremacy confronted, that deals quite a bit with South African history. And I've been keeping up, I would like to think, with trends in this African powerhouse economy. I find disturbing and I almost find it hard to believe that of late in South Africa, there have been rumors of a coup. I still find that hard to believe because of dissatisfaction with the ANC government. You know that in the last election, their majority plummeted below 50%. They entered into a shotgun marriage with the neo-apartheid Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance has a foot in both camps. They're in ostensible alliance with the ANC in Pretoria, but they're making goo-goo eyes at Mr. Trump. And of course, with regard to the new immigration posture of the Trump regime, they're favoring and privileging those from the European minority in South Africa. In fact, you may recall that just a few months ago, at our expense, U.S. taxpayers' expense, dozens of those from that minority have been resettled in the United States of America. So now they become our political problem, joining the ranks of their other comrades, including Elon Musk, born in South Africa, Peter Thiel, Thiel, who was raised in both South Africa and Namibia, David Sachs, the AI crypto czar in the White House, yes, roots in South Africa, Roelof Botha, a name that might be familiar, the king of Silicon Valley in terms of venture capital. He carries the name of Pete Botha, the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa. And so the European minority, which tends to lean to the right, although not 100% to be sure, is very potent because they have global leverage. I mean, as I said to a radio program the other day, they're doing what I'm suggesting that Black Americans do. I mean, they're a minority that relies heavily upon Uncle Sam to put pressure on the government of South Africa so that the government of South Africa won't move towards land redistribution, will weaken affirmative action, weaken what we would call DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera. Certainly, Washington is upset with the ANC government because of its dragging U.S. ally Israel before the International Court of Justice, making out a plausible claim for genocide. South Africa, a stalwart member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, providing a stiff challenge to U.S. hegemony. South Africa conferring at the highest level just the other day with representatives and delegates from the Islamic Republic of Iran, as you know, in the crosshairs of Washington as we speak. So South Africa is not out of the woods by any case. And once again, we had a kind of relationship pre-1994, before elections. That relationship has withered on the vine since 1994. We need to resuscitate and revive that relationship for our mutual benefit.
The next question says, Baba Horne, other than protests and boycotts, what specific actions would you like to see us in America, or even what would you recommend based on history, in America enact to combat Trump and his minions' fascist goals?
Well, I've already mentioned some. I think that we need to reacquaint ourselves with our friends in the international community. That would be in our organization, sending delegates and representatives to this CARICOM AU summit. I would like to see our friends in Washington, D.C., who are now under the gun, open discussions with various embassies in Washington, D.C., who are also under the gun. Canada, the Cuban interest section, The Department of Justice has just put a $50 million bounty on the head of President Maduro of Venezuela. I'm sure that our Venezuelan friends would like to hear from us about mutual goals. But as I said, people usually don't think in this direction when you think of new departures, even though that is what's brought us from the depths of slavery to this point. I'm going to speak to some of my college friends in a few weeks. And one of the suggestions I'm going to make with regard to Black students and African American studies majors at our alma mater is that a qualification for getting a degree in that field should be foreign language facility, should be internships, particularly in United Nations bodies, in Nairobi, in Geneva, for example, and of course in New York City, because this is going to be a long march. And thinking about the next generation and preparing them for the struggles to come, that's what we should be thinking about, and that's what we should be doing. Likewise, I'm going to suggest that internships domestically be considered with regard to unions, for example. 90% plus of our community sells their wages for a living. We came here in the first instance expending labor for free. Now we expend labor for a wage. Unions, which have a mixed record with regard to anti-racism, need to be turned around in large part, and that can come if we prepare our youthful generation by placing them in internships in unions, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, for example, the Postal Workers Union, for example. So that's just a few items off the cuff.
Which languages do you recommend Africans in the U.S. learn?
Oh, I would say Spanish, Kiswahili, Putonghua, what you might call Chinese, Arabic, French, Portuguese.
So European as well as African languages. And I find that learning European languages allows me personally to speak to Africans who also know those European languages as well as their own languages, because I think they don't have as much access to African languages initially. But it is a door, it opens a door to learn African languages from African speakers. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. You always bring clarity, droit, and common sense to linking the past and present. As ancestor Baba Dr. John Henry Clark always said, Pan-Africanism or perish. Uncle Justin, life, prosperity, and health. Someone else said, Baba Quayle, makes sense. African people globally speak those European languages, so learning them allows us to connect with, definitely with our people. As you know, Dr. Horne, I had to step away for a minute, and you may already have spoken about this, and if you have, it's okay, I'll go back and look. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what's happening in Burkina Faso, specifically in the Sahel nations overall.
Well, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, particularly the latter under Mr. Traore, Ibrahim Traore, are holding aloft the torch of sovereignty and independence, setting a model to be emulated in Africa. Needless to say, they attracted negative attention from the former colonial master that is France, not to mention the United States of America. What we need to reflect upon, and for those who are capable, investigate, is that these nations are now faced to a greater or lesser degree with religious insurgencies. That would also include northern Nigeria, for example. I've hypothesized that these so-called religious insurgencies are funded in no small measure by the Gulf monarchs, particularly the United Arab Emirates, which, as we already know, is involved up to its eyeballs in the conflict in Sudan, which is probably the most severe humanitarian crisis on planet Earth right now. In some ways, outstripping what's happening in the Eastern Congo and Gaza. My supposition is that the Gulf monarchs are exporting religious extremism because they don't want the religious extremists knocking on their door at home. And so they give them something to do in Africa, turning Africa into a kind of devil's playground, if you like. But it's exerting tremendous pressure on these Sahel nations, not to mention the pressure from their neighbors. Recall that President Tinubu of Nigeria, after you had to change a regime in neighboring Niger, threatened to invade Niger. Progressive journalists in Nigeria pointed out that the United States has leverage over President Tinubu because when he was a young man in Chicago, he left the United States hurriedly under very suspicious circumstances. And according to these journalists, Washington used that as leverage to lean on him, for example. But at the same time, let's not be one-sided. I think that Nigeria has been very helpful with regard to these CARICOM sessions, which will eventuate, as noted, in Addis Ababa in a few weeks. And then there's Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, which is playing a very dangerous game because on the one hand, President Ouattara is mangling the Constitution in order to run once again for re-election. But at the same time, when he dances to the tune of France, which he tends to do, that means that he's giving oxygen to these religious insurgencies, which could come back to bite him and haunt him because you have a similar political trend in Cote d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast. So it's a very complicated picture right now in West Africa. I could have mentioned the threat to northern Ghana, for example, from religious insurgents, bleeding across the border from Burkina Faso. So it's a very complicated picture. And once again, I would hope that we have organizations that not only can speak to these issues, but also can intervene in a progressive fashion with regard to these issues.
A comment, excellent suggestion regarding thinking global networking. I consider myself a global citizen. This is Brother Sean Edwards. I just came back from Ghana with Professor James Small. The need for global community networking is and has always been important. Thank you, Baba Horne, for the work you do for us and for humanity as a whole. And the next question is, what's a good source to learn about what's going on in Sudan?
Well, it's interesting. I do these interviews, which I, needless to say, recommend on kpfk.org, 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, every Saturday from 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern for an hour. And just off the top of my head, I can recall 3 interviews we've done with specialists on Sudan. One scholar from the University of Washington, I can't remember his name, but putting those key terms into a search engine should retrieve what I just made reference to. Just a week or so ago, I did an interview with Taylor Moore, a sister who specializes in Egypt and Sudan. She has some very interesting things to say about the negative relationship historically between Egypt and Sudan. I did an interview a few weeks ago with a scholar at Yale. I think his name was Alden Young. I can't remember, but anyway, you ought to be able to find it. Okay. He's a specialist on Sudan who writes on Sudan. The chap I mentioned from the University of Washington, actually, I read his book. He writes about Sudan. I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but that's why we have search engines. Yes, it's not a mystery. You ought to be able to find it.
You said KPFK or KPFW?
KPFK.
Okay, .org. And that's what I put in the chat for any of you who are interested in searching to see, to listen to those interviews. I asked, you mentioned religious insurgencies in Islam, thinking about the Sahel states. What about Christianity in other countries like Ghana and Nigeria? I mean, the growth of Christianity and moving people away from tradition and people thinking that what they're doing is learning how to practice democracy through these religions is rampant.
Well, fortunately, the armed religious insurgencies that cloak themselves in Islam should be distinguished from, let's say, the prosperity gospel in Nigeria, for example.
Yes.
Where, as is in the United States, one is promised the heaven and the stars if you drop a few ducats into the collection basket. Now, one can make a sociological critique of the latter practice for sure, but on a scale, it's difficult to compare those who have AK-47s in their hand and are shooting down Malian soldiers and trying to overthrow the regime from these prosperity gospel pastors who are many times just hustlers. Of course, you can make a sociological critique of them. In fact, if you look at my book on the 16th century, I have an entire critique of religion in that book. As a matter of fact, as I tell the story, religion is a cofactor in explaining and explicating how we arrived in North America in the first instance, and some of the perils we face since then. But having said that, once again, I would draw a distinction between these armed insurgents and some of these wings of Christianity.
I get that. I definitely get that. And as you said, the sociological perspective may be needed. It's like one is lulling us to sleep and one is attacking us outright. But I get it. Have you uncovered any further information on Barack Obama Sr. as a CIA plant in the 60s?
Well, this is from my book on Kenya, which needless to say, I recommend, where in doing the research for that book, I encountered a revelation, which is oftentimes typical, but hasn't been followed up on, that Barack Obama Sr., in his move from East Africa to Hawaii, made a stop in France, where he conferred with Irving Brown, who was the main liaison between the CIA and the U.S. trade union movement, a subject that many, including myself, have written about. That is to say, this rather devilish connection between the CIA and the U.S. labor movement. I published that in a book. As oftentimes said, if you want to keep a secret, publish it in a book.
Well, somebody saw it and they know your secret, and now they're asking. What organizations in the U.S. are helping lead the movement for progress in the United States?
Well, there are so many. I mean, I'm reluctant to go down that road because I'll inevitably
leave anybody out.
Omit some to their consternation. But I will mention a movement I'm involved with, and it's close to my heart, which is the Pacifica Radio Network. Even in this era of podcasts and YouTube streaming, there is a continuing credible role for Pacifica. As noted, I do a program on KPFK. I appear regularly on WPFW in Washington, WBAI in New York, periodically on KPFT in Houston, KPFA in Berkeley. So support for Pacifica. Let me engage in a kind of bullet voting where I just focus on Pacifica and get the audience concentrated on Pacifica and not divert their attention to other causes, many of whom are quite worthy.
Okay. We have a recommendation for a source on Sudan. Thank you, Brother Narmer. Ahmed Kabalo. He's the founder of Africa Stream, which is now shut down, but he's been interviewed recently on a number of channels and has shared insights on what's going on in Sudan. He's Sudanese and really dives deep on the history of the conflict. And you mentioned Pacifica. I've heard you a number of times on WPFW. And I hope that those of us who are in this area listen to PFW 89.3 FM. They are doing, doing a commercial for them. They are doing a fundraising drive right now. And so if you listen to Dr. Horne on someone's program or Brother Tony Browder, Brother Kaba, who both have contributed to Appeal and are members of Appeal, think about giving a donation. I do have one, I don't know, is it question, concern? It's probably going to be a question about Pacifica Radio because I listen and I'm wondering why they don't talk about the Sudan or the Congo as much as they talk about Israel and Palestine. I'm not saying don't talk about them, but as you mentioned, what's happening there, what's happening with in Mali with these religious insurgents is huge. It's big, but so many of the programs don't cover those. Is that by design? Is that, what do you know
I
about?
doubt if it's by design. I mean, I think that the U.S. progressive movement is beleaguered. I've analogized it to firefighters who are continually facing fires at the fire station, which makes it difficult for them to fight fires in the community. And as you know, these hosts like myself, and I devote quite a bit of time. I just recommended some of the interviews I've done about the Sudan. I mentioned 3 just off the top of my head, for example. Tomorrow, I'm taping an interview about North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, which are implicated, of course, with regard to neighboring Mali, not to mention Western Sahara, now illegally occupied by Morocco. So I think with regard to PFW, they're going to have to speak for themselves.
Okay.
But I would say just in general that these hosts who are unpaid, they're oftentimes overwhelmed and beleaguered. I mean, it's just like when Mr. Trump came into office again in January 2025. The idea was to flood the zone, as they put it, to put up so many different initiatives on so many different fronts, so many different offensives, that the opposition would be overwhelmed. And to a degree, that has taken place.
True. Yeah, muzzle velocity, as Steve Bannon called it. Just flood the waves, the airwaves, everything with, and it's still happening. So it does take some intention to really focus on something else. Dr. Horne, I know you have a hard stop. We're not at it yet, but we don't have to get to it in order to say thank you so much and to, let you take a few minutes before you have to do something else. That we will, no, my question is, and you may already have said this too, but let me ask, what you working on? What is the next book you're working on? Because you don't stop.
So in a few months, I have a book coming out, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin. As the title suggests, it looks on the tortured history of Hawaii, the 50th, perhaps final state of the United States of America, the overthrow of the regime there by settlers in 1893, a very sophisticated regime that had diplomatic legations all over the world, in fact, but was overwhelmed by the settlers and by a burgeoning U.S. imperialism. Then I'm going to be writing my next book, which I've mostly finished the research on, which deals with North Africa, particularly Egypt, particularly Egypt versus Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, the book will start in the 1860s when many Confederates defeated in the United States migrate to Cairo, where they then lead an invasion of Ethiopia. And of course, as you know, that conflict stretches back centuries. But then it'll go on to tell the story, which I also discuss with Taylor Moore, which I referenced a few moments ago, about this strange and curious history of Egypt, wherein a few decades later, they were involved with Britain in terms of a colonial project in Sudan. They were acting as sort of a placeman for London at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And part of the argument for certain Egyptians, at least the ruling elite, was that Egypt shouldn't be colonized by Britain because we're melanin deficient too. And of course, you could reference in the contemporary sense, one of the stalwarts of the Republican Party today, Dina Habib, now known as Dina Habib Powell McCormick, the spouse of Senator McCormick of Pennsylvania. I'm sure my friend Ron Presley knows about him. And of Egyptian origin, or the recently retired comrade of Jenna Bush on the Today Show, Egyptian, Hoda, K-O-T-B is her surname. So that book will be out hopefully by the end of next year. And I have new projects. One of the ones I'm really excited about is U.S.-China relations, because somebody's going to have to explain to our children and grandchildren the 21st century world, where China most likely would be the preeminent power. I'm going to try to get a head start in doing that. And I'm working on a book, as I said, on Canada, U.S., comparative settler colonialism, and Mississippi slavery. That's going back to my roots, which are, of course, in the Magnolia State, in the heart of darkness when it comes to enslavement.
Mississippi, and that falls where in your timeline? Mississippi enslavement.
Oh, that's of the three latter projects, that's number 3.
Okay. All right, that's the one that kind of hit me the most interest, but not nearly the only interest, because I'm really interested in the U.S. China. I'm interested in the Egypt, Ethiopia. Oh my goodness. And it goes on and on. So now these are going to be our last questions, guys. Erica, thank you. Is there any connection with Bunce Island in Sierra Leone and Liberia and the capital of slavery? And she also asks about why don't we talk more broadly about the Creole population in Sierra Leone, who are characterized as returned enslaved Africans from America. There's a huge population here in the U.S.
Well, let me retrieve a book from my study that I'm reading now that I would like to show to that questioner. This will take 20 seconds.
Okay. You're welcome, Erica. This is great, guys. Isn't this wonderful? My reading list. And
so the bonds of freedom,
increasing.
Liberated Africans and the end of the African slave trade. A lot of this research is conducted in Sierra Leone, in the archive in Sierra Leone. And
what's the name of it again?
The Bonds of Freedom, Liberated Africans and the End of the Slave Trade.
Thank you.
Now, a lot of the research is conducted in Sierra Leone. As you may recall, in the wake of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, Britain moves to circumscribe its role in the African slave trade, feeling that it's not wise to continue bringing grave diggers across the Atlantic to threaten lush profits in Jamaica and Barbados. And then the Royal Navy begins to detain in slave ships on the open seas. And then, say if the potential slaves were from Angola or Mozambique, they dump them in Sierra Leone, which then begets the so-called, in part, the so-called Creole population. And then, as we know, in the wake of the revolt against British rule in North America, leading to the creation of the United States of America, many of the Africans fled to Nova Scotia in Canada, then fled to London, and then that led to the creation of Sierra Leone, with many folks having their roots here in North America. There is a Canadian Broadcasting, South African Broadcasting, BET co-production called The Book of Negroes, starring the sister who played Will Smith's spouse in the Venus and Serena story. Angelou Ellis, I think her name is.
Oh, I can't remember her name.
Yeah, you can find it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, we can find it.
But in any case, there's quite a bit. And then, of course, let's not even talk about the Civil War in Sierra Leone, which was as bitter and bloody as the one in neighboring Liberia. And in fact, had similar dynamics in terms of what might be called the repatriated African population and their descendants coming into conflict with the indigenous African population. I made reference to that when I was talking about the history of Liberia in the 19th century. So for those interested in the history of Liberia, you have a lot of sources to choose from.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. Dr. Horne, I know you wanted to be finished by 12:54, 12:55, and it is that time. Now, there was a question that sneaked in there that I know you can answer very quickly. What American organizations should represent the progressives in the international gatherings coming up? What are you thinking? Yeah.
That's a hard question to answer as far as I'm concerned. As I said, I think that there is a delegation. The international gatherings, I take it, reference is made to the AU CARICOM Summit. With regard to that one, I know that there's a delegation from San Francisco Bay Area. It's mostly comprised, at least in terms of the leadership, of folks from the UC Berkeley campus, for example, and who are all progressive thinkers, for example. And I think we should all wish them well.
Okay, great. Dr. Horne, we really appreciate you every time you come. You make me order 2 or 3 more books. Okay, but it's okay. It's a good thing because that's the treasure that I want to make certain that my children and grandchildren have from me. The books, and understand the importance of books, and especially your books, because you've written so much and you're continuing to just roll them out so that we have really some good sources to go to. So we thank you from the bottom of my heart and all of our hearts here at Appeal. We wish you well always and look forward to perhaps having you in our winter series, which runs from the end of January into March. So by then you'll have another book ready for us.
Oh yeah, my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1893,
Yes.
which of course is the third part of a trilogy. The Counter-Revolution of 1776 on the origins of the United States, Counter-Revolution of 1836 on Texas, and now the Counter-Revolution of 1893. You should infer reasonably that I see counter-revolution as a central theme of the history of this country, which is one of the many reasons we're in so much danger right now.
Okay. Great. Wow. Thank you so very much. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.